Alright, so for this video, I'm going to talk to you about interviewing, which I am terrible at. Interviewing is a skill, and some people are really, really good at it. My partner is really, really good at it. I am not good at it. I know the things that you need to do. I attempt to do them. I am not all that successful, and I know why I'm not all that successful. But I'm going to give you all a set of suggestions, a set of things to think about and work through that if you deploy these things properly, you should be pretty successful, or hopefully should be successful in the interview phase. So, before the interview, you want to research the company that you're applying with, or the organization, an NGO, nonprofit, whatever it is. You want to know as much as you possibly can about this organization, and if possible, you want to know as much as you can about the individual people that you're interviewing with. So you want to do that research. You want to come in with as much data as possible, because as always, knowing your audience is going to help you shape your answers to questions. It's going to help you figure out what you need to ask versus what you need to already know, and so on and so on. So that's one thing. Before the interview, you want to prepare some answers to standard interview questions. And there are lists of these all over the internet. So I'd say go through maybe 3 or 4 online lists, figure out some of the questions that that you're seeing, and start thinking about how you would answer them. So this is going to help you with generic interview questions, things that interviewers across the board might ask that are not specific to that job position. We'll talk more about that in just a minute when we're talking about critically interpreting their questions. But that's some of the preparation stuff you want to do. The other major thing that you want to do to prepare is you want to practice, underline that, italicize it, put stars and exclamation marks around it. Try and find people, especially who have done interviews before in your field, and ask them to practice interview you. Ask them to do a mock interview with you. Have them ask you the kinds of questions that they would ask someone if they were really hiring them, and then have them assess your answers and how you carry yourself, how you present yourself. Have them give you feedback on how well you've done in that interview and what you could do better. That's one of the most useful things that you can possibly do in prepping for an interview. On the day of the interview, some very basic things, but things that you want to be doing. Make sure that you are properly dressed. Wear the best suit that you can afford, or at the very least, dress better than you would dress on the job itself. So, even if it's something like working in lawn care business or something like that, where you would be outside and you'd be wearing work clothes and things like that. If it's something like working as a cashier at a grocery store or something like that, at the very least you want to wear a button-down shirt, tie, and khakis if you're a man. You want to wear a decent skirt or professional trousers. You want to wear a blouse or a button-down shirt if you're a woman, or go for a suit, even though it's overly formal for the job itself. When you're dressing for an interview, you're not dressing for the job, you're dressing for the interview. And that was one of the pieces of advice that I've gotten that I think is really, really important. That you are not, in the interview, you are not dressing like a colleague, you are dressing like an interviewee. And interviewees dress as formally as they can. From a business perspective, obviously, if you show up in in a white tie tuxedo with tailcoat and things like this, that's going to leave the wrong impression. But you want to wear, if you can, a nice business suit, or at the very least, like blazer and khakis, blazer and skirt, kind of thing. Minimal makeup, nice hair and trimmed beard if you have a beard. As much as possible, you want to take out any sort of visible piercings. You want to cover any visible tattoos. And I mean, I have to wear long sleeves to interviews because actually on both arms I have tattoos. So, though I'd wear long sleeves to an interview anyway, and I would recommend that most of you do that. Cover all of those things up. Make sure when you're going into the interview that you have all of the necessary papers easily available. Something like a briefcase is a really good investment for the job market. It's going to make it easy for you to keep everything organized. I would recommend not taking a backpack because a backpack is going to make you look like a student. Again, if it's an internship that you're applying for and you are meant to be a student, that's maybe less of an issue. But if this is for a professional job, get a briefcase or get some sort of leather messenger bag, nice leather messenger bag, something that looks very professional. Make sure you have enough copies of your resume for all of the interviewers. Make sure, and yourself as well. Make sure you have any other necessary paperwork printed out, ready to go, easily available, and organized. When you get into the interview, now this is where things start to get a little tricky because there's three major types of interviews. There's in-person interviews, there's Skype or Zoom interviews, and there's phone interviews. And there's slightly different things you need to know for each of these. So I'm going to talk you briefly through each of them. But starting with in-person interviews, because these are the most traditional, which does not necessarily mean they're the most common anymore. So traditionally, in an in-person interview, you want to enter the room with confidence. You want to hold yourself well. You want to sit up straight. You want to have good posture, etc., better than you normally do. Even if your posture is normally very good, you want to be, again, you are presenting yourself as an interviewee, not as a colleague or a coworker yet. So you want to enter the room with confidence. In the US, traditionally, and I think in like Western Europe, Canada, and so on and so on, we traditionally start with a handshake, hearty handshake, extend the hand, firm grip, etc. Right now, because we happen to be in a particular coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, you may forego the handshake, and that's probably not going to be considered rude right now, though I suspect most interviews are being switched to digital interviews anyway. But so that's traditional in the US. In other cultures, that may not be traditional. In, for instance, a lot of East Asian cultures, you would not start with a handshake because it's not part of their cultural tradition. So you do want to be aware of that if you're interviewing internationally or doing business internationally. Most of the interview itself will probably be devoted to question and answer time. So a couple of things that you want to be thinking about as you're attempting to answer these questions. One is that as much as possible, you want to have practiced some answers to the kinds of questions they're likely to ask. We talked about this earlier. When they ask questions, also you want to identify whether this is a generic question or whether this is a targeted question for this job. So generic questions, I mean, some of the sort of stereotypical ones are things like, if you could be any type of animal, what would you be and why? or what would be the 3 things you would want to have with you on a desert island, or whatever it is. What are your greatest strengths? What are your greatest weaknesses, et cetera, et cetera. And you want to practice answers that are honest, that are somewhat interesting, et cetera, et cetera. Then they're also probably going to be asking questions that are targeted specifically for this job, and that's going to be to feel out so the purpose of the generic questions is likely to be to figure out how you think and to figure out what kind of colleague you're likely to be, because collegiality is a big component of hiring. So when someone is interviewing you, what they're trying to figure out, one of the things they're trying to figure out is, would I want to be around this person 5 days a week from 9 to 5, or whatever the hours of the job are? Would I want to be at company holiday parties with this person? Would I want to potentially have this person over for dinner, whatever it is? So they're trying to figure out whether or not you're going to be a person who fits into this company. So that's the purpose of the generic questions. The purpose of the targeted questions is more likely to be, can you do this specific job? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the skills? Do you have the experience? Do you have the background to actually complete what we need you to complete, to fulfill the role we need you to fulfill, et cetera, et cetera. So the targeted questions are really going to depend on what the job is, but they're going to be more questions like, tell us about your educational experiences, tell us about your previous work experiences, tell us how you would handle this type of situation, and things like this. And you want to shape all of those answers based on what it is that they're looking for. So what is it, what information do they want in asking that question? So that's the way that my former mentor put it, and I think this is really the right way to think about it, is what's the underlying anxiety behind this question? What is it that they actually want to know when they've asked you this thing? So are they concerned that you don't have enough experience? Are they concerned that you don't have enough knowledge? Are they concerned that you're not going to be a good fit for the way their organization approaches this issue? And try and shape your answer to satisfy that underlying anxiety. So those are the things. The other big thing that you want to do during the interview is continually refer back to your experiences, continually refer back to outcomes. So I did X thing here. So you've asked me about, all right, I'm going to draw directly on my experience doing academic interviews, which are somewhat similar to interviews outside academia. So a question, for instance, might be, how would you teach a section of introductory British literature since 1800? My answer might be something like, well, in the past, when I've taught this online, one of the things that I did was organized it by period. So I organized it into 3 different historical eras, and that gave the course a really effective shape, and that gave my students a very easy sort of chronological way to follow through similarities and changes in how people approached writing and approached artistic creation. So that answer is probably incomplete, because the next phase of that answer would be, so in the future I would do X. But this is the kind of thing that you want to be thinking about. And actually, part of the reason I cut my answer off when I did is because I don't want this video to be about me. But the idea here is, I have done X. here was the outcome of X. It was successful or it was unsuccessful. Therefore, I would bring X to your organization. This is very similar to the kinds of things that you want to do in your application letter. So you're focusing on particular concrete experiences, you're giving examples, and then you're talking about how successful or hopefully not unsuccessful those experiences were. I did X thing, it worked well in this way, here's what I learned and can bring to your company if you hire me. That's the basic formulation you want to use for most questions. Toward the end of the interview, it's very likely that they will say, do you have any questions for us? Yes, is the answer. You want to come up with a few questions that you could ask. You want to come up, I'd say, with at least 3 or 4 questions that you could ask, in part because some of the questions or some of the information that they give you in the interview may actually answer some of those questions. So if you only thought up one question to ask and they answer it in the interview, then you're out of luck. But you want to ask some questions because that shows you're interested, it shows you're engaged, and it shows that you are thinking about what they want. And actually that's the question, one of the questions that I always go with is, and you can borrow this if you want, I borrowed it from someone else. So my sort of default question at this stage is there anything specific that you all are looking for someone for this job? Is there anything specific you want about the person that you hire for this job? And that's a good question because A, it forces them, if they haven't already, to really think specifically about what they want. And you'd be surprised how often they haven't thought about that. But it also gives you a good sense of what exactly they're envisioning, which is useful information for you to have. But you want to also be thinking about some other questions that you might ask about the company or about the job or things like that. You don't want to ask about salary. If salary hasn't already been discussed, you want to leave that for specific contract negotiations. That because discussion of salary can be a potentially problematic issue. Obviously, in the real world, we all know that you are attempting to get this job to get a salary, but one of the things you want to pretend while you're on the job market is that you want to work for this company because you love the company and they're great and you would work for them for free if they weren't going to give you a salary. Obviously, that's not true in reality, but it's one of the fictions that we all sort of work under in the job market. So don't ask about salary. That's going to be the big one. The other thing, and this is a tricky one, and I don't have good advice on this, but you want to, first off, you want to be aware of the questions that they're not legally allowed to ask you, and you want to develop some kind of strategy for if you get asked those questions anyway. So, for instance, they're not legally allowed to ask you things like your religious views. They're not legally allowed to ask, or your religious affiliation. They're not legally allowed to ask about your sexual preferences. They're not legally allowed to ask about whether you're married. They're not legally allowed to ask about various other kinds of things. So you want to be aware of what they are and aren't allowed to ask you. How you handle it if they do ask you an illegal question, and it does unfortunately happen sometimes, you want to be very tactful. That's my first piece of advice. But you want to figure out how you are going to handle it. And different people will handle it in different ways. Chances are, if you call the interviewer out for asking an illegal question, that's likely to mean you don't get the job. There is a line of argument that says if they're going to ask illegal questions during the job interview, that maybe isn't a place you want to work at anyway. You can contact human resources later on. That's another option that may or may not create problems for you. You can let it go. That's an option. That may be the most likely way of not upsetting the interviewer to the point where they choose not to give you a job. But it also makes it easier for them to continue going on and asking illegal questions to other interviewees. So how you choose to handle, I'm not going to give you much specific advice about how you would handle it, because I don't think there's a good way of handling it. But you want to think about that a little bit before you go into an interview. Then after an interview, one of the other things, you want to be sort of perky and excited in the interview. That's part of the reason I'm not good at them. And that's actually especially true, I think, for Skype interviews or Zoom interviews or whatever it is, and especially for phone interviews. So when you are Skyping, when you're doing Zoom interviews, something like this, where you can see the people, but you're not in the same room through sort of video chat, things like this, you want to be energetic because you need to overcome the fact that you are not physically in the same space. So you want to make sure that you are conveying enthusiasm, you're conveying excitement, you're conveying energy. And on the phone, you want to do this as well, because it's even harder when you're a disembodied voice speaking to them and their disembodied voices speaking to you. So you want to be as upbeat, as excited, and you want to use a little bit of humor. If you can make them laugh, you're more likely to be memorable. That's the issue that I have, is that as you all know at this stage, I tend to be fairly monotone in the way that I speak. I tend to be more sort of subdued, etc., etc. And so that's not a particularly good interviewing approach. My partner tends to be much more energetic, and so she tends to do a lot better in interviews than I do, whereas I tend to be somewhat bland and boring, as you know. So the last thing I want to tell you about very briefly is what you do after the interview. So the first thing that you should do after the interview is email everyone who was on that interview committee, thank them for taking the time to talk to you, tell them that you enjoyed your conversation, and if possible, bring up something specific that they asked about or that they said, and sort of build a connection with that. Make this a personal message if possible. There are different schools of thought about whether or not to sort of follow up on whether you got a job. Typically, my suggestion is no. Hiring is an idiosyncratic process. It sometimes runs on schedule, it sometimes doesn't run on schedule. Like I've done interviews where they've said you will hear on X date. I heard 5 days later, and I said, sorry, we've hired somebody else. Following up would not necessarily have benefited me, but the schedule didn't run quite as quickly as they thought it was going to. So that's something to be aware of. There are those who say if you don't hear back within a week or 2 weeks or something like this, you should send an email following up. I would say try and figure out what the standard is in the industry that you're in. So for the particular type of business that you are applying for, is it standard to send a follow-up, or is it standard to just wait until they contact you? In academia, we wait until they contact us, but that's not necessarily the best advice for other industries. So you want to figure that out for yourself.